I know that my mother came with her family a bit maybe later than others from the March 68 movement. I think she came maybe in the end of 69 or beginning of 70, like in January, when they thought it was no longer viable for them to stay in Poland. And I haven't talked that much with my mother about how she experienced it or what had happened or something like that, but my grandmother wrote a biography some 20 years ago, which I have read, and it's mostly from there that I remember how they came to Sweden and where they lived. Remember, my mother has talked about they were staying at a refugee camp in, I think, Alvesta in the southern part of Sweden. And then my mother and her brother went to Lund to study, Lund University, to continue to study after the initial period as refugees in Sweden. And my brother then went on to study in the United States, and my mother stayed in Sweden and studied, moved to Stockholm and studied at Stockholm University. Yeah, so I mean, I know why they left. I know like the story behind the reason why they had to leave and how many Jews emigrated in '68 roughly. I know like sketches of that story. The anti-Semitism of Gomulka blaming the student protests on Jewish elements or foreign elements. I haven't asked that much, but I don't think she would be opposed to telling me about her time in Poland. She has talked a little bit about various things that happened to her when she was little or during her childhood years, that because she had Jewish heritage, she had to, for example, stand outside the classroom when they had Catholic classes or religious classes. And I also know that, for example, my uncle was, I remember a story of them telling, I mean, my uncle was beaten sometimes on his way to school by other Polish kids, so he had two Polish friends who went with him who escorted him more or less, from and to school so that he wouldn't be beaten up. I remember that. I also, 2 years ago, I lived in Warsaw for 1 month and studied some Polish and went around the city, and then my mother came and visited with my girlfriend, and we went, just walked around the city, and my mother pointed to the apartments where she had lived and where she went to school and where the ghetto was, and we looked at all those different things. So I suppose I know some things, but I don't have the entire story, no. We went to Poland a couple of times, for vacation or something like that, because she still knew some people who lived in Poland. And as I grew up, we lived in a villa in the suburb in Enskede, which had 2 family apartments. So we lived in one half of the side, and in the other side was also a Polish Jewish family who had left in '68. But the father of that family and my mother got to know each other during the '80s in Sweden. And then they lived together in that villa. So, and the other family had, who lived in the other house, still had some relatives in Poland. So, I remember I visited, and the son of that family is also my best friend. So we visited his grandmother, who lived, she lived in Warsaw for maybe 6 months or 8 months a year, and then came to Stockholm for a couple of months. And I remember going on vacation with my mother, him, and his mother in Poland, and I don't know, I must have been like between 8 and 12 maybe, or something like that. And then I visited Poland a couple of times. I think I feel more Jewish than Polish because I think my mother identifies more as Jewish than Polish, as opposed to my best friend who lived in the other apartment, because his parents were both Polish, which meant that they spoke Polish at home, which we didn't do in my house because my dad is Swedish and he doesn't know Polish, or he knows, a couple of words, but not that much. But I spoke Polish up until I was maybe 9 years old or something, with my mother sometimes. But then I had language classes when I was 7, 8, and 9 in Polish after school, which was like a Swedish program for people who had parents from abroad, that they could learn the language of their parents at school after school hours for like 1 hour a week or something. So I did that when I was 7 to 9, but then I changed schools, and then I didn't like the teacher or the classes in Polish at my new school, so I quit and didn't know. So now I understand Polish, like sometimes if you speak a little bit slower, but I can't really speak it myself that well. Yeah, so I was always aware that I was Jewish when I was growing up, and my friends, when I was in school, they called me Jew or something like that. They were my friends, so it was in a nice way, and it was only my friends who did it, but it was still defining me, I think, more as a Jew than as Pole, because I also didn't speak Polish.